Nobody in that room was supposed to question her twice. Third, to 4 years, 6 combat deployments, for wars across 3 continents. Rear Admiral General Harrison Webb had looked into the eyes of men who had survived things that had no right to be survived, and he had never once flinched. He had walked the hallways of the most classified operation centers in the Western Hemisphere without slowing his step. He had signed orders that rearranged the geography of conflict zones, and he had done it without pausing to pour his second cup of coffee. The man was built from certainty, the way mountains are built from pressure, slowly, completely, without apology. Nobody questioned Harrison Webb's judgment, not in 34 years. And yet, the moment she walked through that door, he stopped mid-sentence. His jaw didn't drop. That wasn't his style, but his jaw tightened in a way his aide had never seen before. And the sentence he had been delivering to 3 senior officers simply ceased to exist, as though the words had evaporated somewhere between his mind and the air. She was 28 years old. She was carrying a M82 A1 in a drag bag over her left shoulder and pinned to the inside collar of her jacket. Not displayed, not flaunted, pressed against a fabric where only she could feel, it was a sniper qualification pin that had not been awarded to an active field operative in this particular theater in 11 years. The last person who earned it was already dead, and that person had been the only one who ever believed she could do this. Nobody in that room could answer the question Webb was about to ask. But by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why his hand went still the moment she set that rifle case on his conference table without being asked, without permission, without blinking. If this story grips you from the first sentence, consider subscribing and following the channel. More stories like this are coming, and you won't want to miss them. Drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from right now. I want to see how far this story reaches, because stories like Hayes deserve to travel. 3 months before the conference room, the range at Fort Bragg smelled the way it always smelled in November. Diesel from the generator trucks on the east perimeter. Cold earth turned up by recent rain and a particular sharp bite of propellant that no amount of ventilation ever fully cleared. Captain Nadia Reeves had been lying in the same position for 4 hours and 17 minutes. She had not shifted her weight. She had not flexed her fingers. Her breathing had settled, sometime in the second hour, into a rhythm so shallow and controlled that Corporal Denny Marsh, watching through a spotcope 11M to her left, had twice leaned forward to check if she was still conscious. She was more conscious than anyone else on that range. The target was a steel plate 12 in X12N at a measured distance of 2,189 m. That is not a standard range distance. There is no standard range distance that reaches 2,189 m. The Army does not officially train for shots at 2,189 m because the Army officially considers that distance to be beyond reliable engagement range for any man-portable system. The man who had set this target had done it precisely because of that word reliable. He had wanted to know what existed on the other side of reliable. He had spent 23 years finding out. And what he had found was that the boundary between possible and impossible was not a wall. It was a mirror, and what it reflected back at you was not the target. It was you. That man was Master Sergeant Elias Reeves. He had been dead for 14 months. Nadia exhaled. The exhale was not dramatic. It was the last 10% of a breath she had been releasing for 40 seconds, disciplined and patient and barely audible above the wind. She held the intersection of that breath, the place between out and in where the body is perfectly still, where no muscle is expanding and no muscle is contracting. The half-second window that snipers call the natural respiratory pause. And in that window, she pressed. The Barrett M82 A1 speaks in a language that is not about subtlety. It is a 0.50 BMG, round, traveling at 2,910 foot pulse, carrying 13,350 FTLB of energy at the muzzle. When it fires, the sound arrives a full second and a half after the round has already reached its destination at shorter distances. At 2,189 m, the round was already through the air and into the steel before anyone standing beside the gun had fully processed the sound. The plate rang like a cracked church bell. It rang once. It did not move from its post because the post was embedded in concrete, but the sound it made was the sound of something that had not expected to be hit from that distance. Marsh looked up from his scope. He looked at the target. He looked back at her. He opened his mouth and then closed it. She was already cycling the bolt again. She said that was all. The second shot arrived at the same point on the plate. 3.44 centimeters from the first strike, at 2,189 m in a crosswind, she had calculated by watching the Mirage heat shimmer off the ground at 4 separate range markers and integrating that data without a ballistic calculator, because a ballistic calculator was in her bag and she had not reached for it once. Marsh finally spoke. Betsy started. He stopped. He tried again. "Chief, that's not a thing that people do." "Elias did it," she said. Her voice was quiet, not modest, just factual, the way a mechanic states talk specs. She reached inside her jacket, not for anything dramatic. She did it the way people reach for things they have reached for 1,000 times, automatically, without looking. Her fingers found the edge of a small notebook, cloth-bound, the cover soft with ease of handling, as she pressed her thumb against its spine for exactly 1 second before releasing it and sitting up from the firing position. The notebook had belonged to Elias Reeves. He had carried it in the same jacket pocket through 6 deployments, 2 sniper causes, and 1 operation that had divided the entire special operations community into 2 camps. Those who said he was wrong and those who understood. Nadia had been 17 years old when that operation happened. She had been sitting across a kitchen table from a man who had just returned from something he was not allowed to describe, watching him write something in that notebook by the light above the stove. And the expression on his face was not guilt and was not victory. It was the expression of someone who had chosen the harder truth and was still choosing it every day with the full weight of knowing what it had cost him. The note he wrote that night was still in the notebook. She had not read it the night he wrote it. She had not been meant to, but she had read it since many times. And the line that lived at the center of it, written in his cramped, deliberate hand, was this: "The scope shows you what is. The stillness shows you what matters." She had never heard him explain it. He had died before she understood it fully. But she carried it the way soldiers carry the things that cost the most. Not displayed, but present. Not forgotten, not performed. Simply there, Sergeant Major Dennis Holloway appeared at the firing line 8 minutes later, and the expression on his face was the first version of what Nadia Reeves would spend the next 3 months watching shift and change, and eventually break open in men who had spent decades being certain about things that turn out to be less permanent than they believed. Olai was 61 years old, had completed the Q course at Fort Bragg before Nadia had been born, and had the particular bearing of a man who had made peace with the limits of human performance, because he had spent a lifetime mapping those limits. He looked at the target downrange through his own scope. He looked at it for a long time. "Who set this range at 2,200 m?" he asked. 2,189, Nadia said. Olai turned. He was not a man given to overt expressions, but something moved behind his eyes. Not quite respect, not quite disbelief. Something between them that had not yet resolved into a single thing. "I said it myself," she added. "This morning, and you hit it twice." 3 times, Marsh offered from behind his spotting scope. The third one I didn't call out loud because I thought I'd misread. Olai looked at her for a full 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time to look at someone without speaking. "Where did you learn that hold?" he asked finally, not accusatory, genuinely needing to know. "Master Sergeant Reeves," she said. The silence that followed that name was a different kind of silence from the one after the shots. It had texture to it. Wait. Elias Reeves had been gone for 14 months. But the echo of what he had done his last operation, and more pointedly, the echo of the controversy it had generated, was still present in every room where his name was spoken. He had made a choice, a sniper's choice, and in making it, he had either saved a life or wasted a mission, depending entirely on which side of the argument you were standing. The inquiry had been closed without conclusion. His record remained formally unmarked, but the mark was there anyway in the way people said his name, carefully, like something that might still be warm. Olai said nothing more. He simply walked back down the range, toward the operations building, but he walked differently than he had arrived. Not slowly, but with the particular deliberateness of a man mentally revising something he had thought was already finished. That evening, Nadia received a message routed through secure channels. 17 words, no sender identification that meant anything in standard terms. The routing code, however, meant everything. It belonged to an office within the Joint Special Operations Command that did not formally appear on any organizational chart she had access to. And the message said, report to Building 14 Alpha Fort Bra, 500 hours. Bring the rifle. She read it once. Then she folded the message, placed it inside the notebook next to the page where Elias's handwriting sat in its quiet permanent authority, and she set her alarm for 0340. She did not sleep well, not because she was afraid, because she recognized with the particular precision of someone trained to read terrain at a distance that the ground ahead of her had changed. Something was in motion, something large, and whatever it was, it had her name attached to it. Building 14 Alpha did not look like a place where the future was decided. It looked like a storage facility that the base maintenance crew had not gotten around to repainting since the previous decade. The fluorescent light in the entry hallway buzzed at a frequency that sat just below the threshold of irritation. The coffee on the folding table near the door was cold, and someone had left a styrofoam cup beside the machine with a ring of dried brown residue that suggested it had been sitting there since the previous afternoon. Nadia drank it anyway. Cold coffee was still coffee. There were 4 other people in the room when she arrived. She recognized none of them by face, though she recognized 2 of them by the particular way they stood, with the contained stillness of people who had spent significant portions of their careers in positions where stillness was not a choice, but a survival requirement. One of them was a man in his mid-40s with no visible insignia on his jacket. The other was a woman Nadia estimated at 35, with the kind of economy of movement that spoke of extensive field experience and the kind of calm that comes not from absence of feeling, but from having long since learned to root feeling somewhere useful. The 5th person entered 3 minutes after Nadia. He was lean, silver-haired at the temples, and wore the kind of expression that suggested he had been up since before 0300 and considered this a perfectly ordinary state of affairs. He carried a manila folder that was visibly thin, not because the subject was simple, but because the people who prepared it had been extremely careful about what went on paper. He placed it on the table without opening it. I'm Colonel Harrove, he said. No rank theater. No pause for acknowledgement. What I'm about to tell you is classified at a level that means you don't discuss any component of it with anyone not in this room. Not your team leads, not your unit commanders, not your families. This classification does not have a standard compartment name. That itself tells you something. He paused, not for effect, but because he was choosing the next word with the precision of someone who understood that in this particular context, imprecision was its own kind of danger. We have a problem. The problem has a name. The name is Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole. The name did not land quietly in Nadia's chest. It landed the way a stone lands in still water, with a disturbance that spread in concentric rings before she could stop it. Marcus Cole had been trained by Elias Reeves. He had been for 2 years before the controversy and the inquiry and the 14 months of silence the closest thing to a peer Nadia had ever encountered in her specific discipline. They had not been friends. They had been rivals in the truest professional sense. Each of them pushed further by the existence of the other, each aware that the other occupied the same rare and narrow space of ability. She had not seen him in 2 years. She had not tried to. Cole has been identified, Harrove continued, as the source of a series of intelligence compromises that go back approximately 22 months. The compromises are specific. They relate to the positioning and movement schedules of 3 separate precision assets in theater. Assets whose identities are not being shared in this room. 2 of those assets are now dead. 1 is still operational, and we believe Cole's handlers are aware of that individual's current position. He opened the folder for the first time. He slid 1 photograph across the table. Cole is now operating as a contractor loosely defined for a network with connections across 3 jurisdictions. He has not been captured because he is operationally still exceptional. He knows how we look for people like him because he was one of the people who built the methodology. Nadia looked at the photograph. It was Marcus Cole, taken from a distance. Thermal processed, standing on a rooftop in a city she recognized but was not going to name aloud. He was looking through a scope. He was even in a thermal photograph, unmistakably himself. The way he held a rifle, the precise angle of his shoulder, the stillness, the same stillness. She understood then fully what she had suspected since the message arrived the previous evening. This was not a briefing. This was a selection. Why me? She asked. Hager looked at her steadily. Because you're the only active operative in this command who trained under the same system, using the same methods at the same level. You know his tendencies. You know his patience thresholds. You know what he does when he believes is undetected. He paused, and because the asset still in the field specifically requested you. The room was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent light bust. She could feel the notebook against her ribs. Who is the asset? She asked. That information becomes available to you at mission acceptance, Harrove said. She looked at the photograph again. She thought about the last time she had stood on a range beside Marcus Cole. Both of them shooting at targets that were not targets. Targets that were ideas, limits, the edges of what a human being trained long enough and seriously enough could reach. She thought about the way he had looked at her after she outshot him for the first time, and how his expression had not been angry or resentful. It had been something closer to relieved, as though being surpassed by someone who was serious about it was better than remaining unchallenged. She thought about what Elias had said about Marcus once in the kitchen by the light above the stove. He's the best I've ever trained, except that I'm not done training you yet. She thought about the fact that Marcus Cole had, by the accounting of the photograph and the folder and the 2 dead assets, taken everything Elias had given him and turned it into a tool for the opposite of what Elias had meant it to be. She thought about the pin inside her collar, the weight of it against her skin. I accept, she said the same way she had said again at the firing range. The same quiet, the same weight. Hargrove nodded once. He slid a second document across the table. There is one additional component to this mission that you will need to understand before we proceed to operational specifics. She looked at the document. She read the first 3 lines. She read them again. General Webb is the mission authority. Pro said all operational parameters require his sign-off. This includes personnel selection. His tone remained level, but something shifted in it. Not quite apology, not quite warning. He has reviewed your file. Here's some questions. She put the document down. Questions about your qualifications for this specific assignment. The light buzzed. The cold coffee tasted of nothing in particular. She understood. Harrison Webb, 34 years, 6 deployments for wars. Harrison Webb had questions about whether a 28-year-old woman whose mentor had been the subject of a closed but not resolved inquiry was the right choice for the most sensitive precision mission his command had authorized in 22 months. His questions were not petty. They were not born of ignorance. They were the questions of a man who had carried enormous responsibility for a very long time and understood exactly what happened when the wrong person was chosen for the wrong mission. His skepticism was reasonable. That made it in its own way harder. When do I meet him? She asked. Tomorrow morning, Hagros said. He'll be expecting you to convince him. She reached into her jacket. Her fingers found the notebook spine. 1 second. She released it. I'll be there, she said. The drive to the secure facility took 4 to 7 minutes. She spent them in silence, watching the road, doing what Elias had called pre-quiet. Not meditation, not visualization, not any of the language that had grown up around the concept of mental preparation. Just silence, deliberate, and inhabited the way a scope is inhabited before a shot, fully without reservation, with everything unnecessary set aside. Elias had nodded words for most of what he taught. He had demonstrated, and then he had watched, and when she got it right, he had said nothing because saying nothing was his version of the highest acknowledgement. She had taken years to understand that. She had taken even longer to stop wanting more than that. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with him. It had not been the kind of last conversation that felt significant at the time. He had called on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before the operation that would end his life, and it had talked for 11 minutes about wind calculations at altitude and the particular way thin air above 9,000 feet changed the behavior of the 050 BMG round. And At the end, he had said in that voice that made everything sound like a simple observation. You're the only one I've trained who gets genuinely quieter when things get harder. Most people get loud internal noise. You go still. Remember that stillness is not a gift. It's an argument. It argues back against everything that says you can't. She had written it in the back of her own notebook that night, in her own handwriting. She had not needed to write it down. She already knew it. But some things needed to be written, not to be remembered, but to be honored. The facility appeared around a curve in the road. A concrete structure built for function and nothing else, with a flag outside that moved in a wind that hadn't fully decided its direction. She stepped out of the vehicle, adjusted the drag bag on her shoulder, and walked toward the entrance. General Harrison Webb was already inside. She could see him through the reinforced glass of the outer corridor, standing with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, looking at a map on the wall with the focused attention of someone who was not looking at the map at all, but using it as a surface to think against. He was bigger than his photograph suggested, not tall so much as dense, the kind of physical presence that came from decades of physical commitment to a standard that never lowered. His aide, a young captain whose name Tagadia didn't catch, opened the door without speaking. Webb turned. He looked at her for 4 seconds, the same 4-second measure. His eyes dropped for a fraction of a moment to the drag bag on her shoulder, then back to her face. "Captain Reeves," he said. "General," she said. "Who are you?" he asked. The words were direct, not hostile. The question of a man who needed a true answer, not a biography. She did not flinch. She did not reach for credentials or citations or the language of resume. She set the drag bag down on his conference table, not carefully, not gently, but with the calm authority of someone setting down a tool that belonged exactly where she was putting it. And she looked at him. "I'm the person who can find Marcus Cole," she said. "And I'm the person who can stop him without destroying the one asset he doesn't know we still have in the field." Webb's jaw tightened, not in anger, an involuntary way of a man whose assessment is being revised in real time and who is not yet ready to let that revision finish. "Harrove tells me you train under Reeves." He said yes. Elias Reeves. Yes. Something moved in the room, not as something heavier. The inquiry into his last operation concluded without formal finding. Webb said his voice was neutral. The neutrality of a man who had opinions about that inquiry, but had learned to separate his opinions from his operational requirements, which means his record is clean. Which also means, and here his voice shifted by approximately 1 degree towards something that was not quite an edge, that what he chose to do in the field that day remains officially undefined. Undefined means I don't know if it was wisdom or breakdown. Nadia held his gaze. She knew what he was asking. He was asking whether her loyalty to Elias Reeves's memory had shaped her judgment in ways that would make her an asset or liability. He was asking whether she was the product of good training or the product of a complicated man's unresolved legacy. The question was fair. The question deserved a real answer. "Sir," she said with respect, "by the end of this mission, you'll know exactly what it was." She reached into her jacket. She extracted the notebook, not hurriedly, not ceremoniously, and placed it on the table beside the drag bag. Then she opened the drag bag and began the systematic assembly of the Barrett M82A1. She did not ask for permission. She did not explain what she was doing. Her hands moved with a precision that was not performed. The precision of someone who has done the same thing so many times that the motion has become part of the body's language. Like breathing, like standing, like the particular way a human voice drops when it's telling the truth. 14 seconds. That was the assembly time. She knew it was 14 seconds because Elias had timed her the first time she did it correctly, and she had been working since that day. On the 14, Webb watched the entire 14 seconds without speaking. When the rifle was assembled, bipod deployed, scope mounted, the massive .050 caliber barrel pointing with its particular gravity toward the far wall. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the notebook. Then he looked at the pin she had not shown him, the one pressed against the inside of a collar where he could not yet see it, though something in his expression suggested he was aware of something he hadn't placed yet. "Hog Grove tells me," he said slowly, "that you hit a target at 2,189 m twice." 3 times, she said. The third one Corporal Marsh initially declined to call. Something happened in Webb's expression that was not a smile, but contained the structural elements of one. His aide standing near the door had gone very still in the way that people go still when they are witnessing something they will describe in detail to their colleagues later. The current confirmed record for a successful long-range precision engagement operational context is 3,540 m. Webb said that record stands. I know, she said, you're not here to break records. He said no. She said, I'm here because Marcus Cole is operational at a range that makes conventional interdiction impractical in terrain that makes approach on foot as 72-hour minimum and in a window that closes in approximately 91 hours from this morning. She picked up the notebook. She opened it to the page where Elias's handwriting sat, and she turned it so Webb could see the line, the one that had lived in her chest for 14 months. She did not read it aloud. She let him read it. The scope shows you what is. The stillness shows you what matters. He read it. He read it a second time. The color that drained from his face did so from the forehead fast. She watched it the way she watched wind shifts clinically without judgment. And it was not fair. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who has just understood a geometry that was invisible to him a moment before. He looked up from a notebook. He wrote that. Webb said it wasn't a question. Yes. When? The night before the operation. She said the one the inquiry was about. The room was completely silent. The aide near the door appeared to have stopped breathing. Webb set the notebook down with a care that was different from the care of someone handling a document. It was the care of someone handling something that had weight beyond its physical weight. Sit down, Captain, he said. His voice had changed, not softened. Exactly. Resolved. The way a lens resolves when the focus ring finds the right position and everything that was blurred becomes simply clay. I need to hear everything you know about Cole's current positioning methodology. She's Saturday. She set the notebook to her left, the M82 to her right, and she began to talk. Her voice did not rise. Her hands did not move. And in the quiet of that room, in the cold light of a building that smelled of concrete and old machinery, something that had been a question began for the first time to become an answer. 48 hours. That was all the time left. She could feel it in the particular tension of the air. The way the information in Hogro's folder had aligned itself in her mind into a shape she recognized. The shape of a window that was closing, and behind it, a situation that would not forgive a late arrival. But there was something else. Something Harrove had not yet told her. Something she had registered in the 3 lines of the second document before he had redirected the conversation. Something in the wording that did not fully align with the stated mission. A detail that sat wrong. The way a rifle sits wrong when it hasn't been zeroed to the shooter. Technically functional, but often a way that only the person holding it can feel. She had not asked about it yet. She was waiting the way Elias had taught her to wait. Not passively, not with patience as a virtue, but with the active intelligence of someone gathering data before speaking. Because in her world, the question asked too early was the question that warned the wrong person. There is someone inside this building, inside this command, who had been feeding information to Marcus Cole for 22 months. Hargrove had not said so. The document had not stated it. But the shape of the intelligence failures, the specific nature of the compromises, the fact that Cole had known exactly when to move and where the assets were positioned, these things did not emerge from external intelligence alone. They emerged from proximity, from access. She pressed her thumb against the spine of the notebook once, without taking it from the table. The scope shows you what is. The stillness shows you what matters. She was going to need both. She thought in the next 48 hours she was going to need both more than she had ever needed anything. The formal qualification assessment was not on any schedule she had been given. Webb called for it 22 minutes into their conversation. Without announcement, without explanation, he simply stood, walked to the far end of the room, pressed the code into a panel she had not noticed beside the secondary door, and said, "Follow me." His aide stayed behind. That was the first signal. When Harrison Webb moved without his aide, the next thing that happened was not procedural. The room beyond the secondary door was long and low-ceiling, lit by blue-white strip lighting that gave everything a quality of absolute definition. No shadows to hide in, no warmth to soften the edges. It smelled of gun oil and recirculated air. At the far end, an integrated target system had been configured. She could see this before she fully entered the room, reading the layout and the way she read terrain, distances, obstacles, sightlines, variables. The system was running. 3 targets were active. Distances, she estimated before looking at the readout on the side panel of 600 m, 1,100 m, and 1,847 m. The last one positioned through a series of angle baffles that meant the direct line of sight was partially obscured and the round would need to pass through a gap of approximately 14 centimeters between 2 steel plates to reach it. At 1,847 m, through a 14 centimeters gap, she looked at Webb. He had his arms crossed and was looking at the target system with a particular expression of a man who has set a problem and is genuinely uncertain of the outcome. Not performing uncertainty, but experiencing it. That was the second signal. He had not arranged this room in advance. He had accessed a facility that existed for exactly this purpose. He had done this before. The question was whether anyone had ever satisfied it completely. Rules, she said. No rules, Webb answered. Only results. She returned to the main room. She carried the M82 by the grip, the bipod folded, the weight of it across her forearm with the easy familiarity of something that had been part of her body's vocabulary for 6 years. She set it at the firing position, a low concrete ledge designed for exactly this, worn smooth by the number of arms that had rested there before hairs. And she did not hurry. Hurrying at this point would have been a statement of the wrong kind. She settled into position. The cold of the concrete came through her jacket, familiar and focusing. She took 3 breaths of medium depth. Then she allowed the breath to slow, then slower. The third target, the 1,847 m gap shot, was visible only as a sliver of reflective material between the 2 baffle plates, a line of light no wider than a finger at this distance. She watched it. She let her vision rest on it without forcing attention. The way Elias had taught her to look at things she needed to understand without demand, without urgency, because the eye under pressure reaches for shortcuts and shortcuts at this distance with a difference between data and assumption. The wind in the contained space was minimal, but not zero. There was a ventilation current moving left to right, generated by the air handling system in the ceiling. She had felt it on the left side of her neck when she walked in. She adjusted 0.44 minutes of angle to the right. She fired the first target, 617 m center. The sound absorbed into the baffled walls without ceremony. She moved to the second 1,100 m. She was slightly high. She could see it before Marsh called it. Though there was no Marsh in this room, only Webb, and Webb said nothing. She noted the correction internally and filed it. 1 click down, she fired again. Center. She moved to the third target, the gap, the sliver. At 1,847 m through 14 centimeters of clearance, she let herself go completely quiet. Not the external quiet of the room, which was already considerable, but the internal quiet, the one that had no language for it except the language Elias had given her. The stillness shows you what matters. She was not thinking about Webb. She was not thinking about the mission or Marcus Cole or the notebook or the pen against her collar. She was thinking about nothing at all, which is the only thought that has no error in it. She exhaled, found the pores pressed. The sound arrived a fraction behind the result. The sliver of reflective material at the back of the target system caught the round and disappeared into a hole she could not see from here, but knew was there with the same certainty that she knew her own heartbeat, which had in the 20 seconds before the shot dropped to 4 to 4 beats per minute. Complete silence. Webb uncrossed his arms. He walked to the downrange readout panel and looked at it for 7 seconds. Then he turned to look at her, and the thing that had not resolved in his expression the first time they met, that suspended jury of assessment and doubt and experienced judgment, resolved not loudly, not with fanfare. The way a night sky resolves into its full depth when your eyes finally fully adjust suddenly, completely, irrevocably. Reeves, he said she was already removing the magazine, clearing the chamber with the same economy of motion. I've seen the system used 41 times, he said. His voice was different now, not warmer. Webb was not a man who became warm, but leveled away his scope levels when the bubble settles. Nobody has cleared all three. Two people have come close. Elias Reeves cleared the first two and called the third wind before he could set up. She looked up. He was never cleared for the range that day. Webb said, I was the officer who denied his access. There was a procedural question about his unit's current standing. I signed the denial. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I've spent 14 months wondering whether the thing he did in that final operation, the choice the inquiry couldn't classify, was because of what I denied him or in spite of it. Nadia held the rifle against her side. She felt the notebook against her ribs. She looked at Webb for a long moment and chose her words with the same precision she applied to everything. He would have made that shot, she said, and it wouldn't have changed the choice he made. The choice had nothing to do with the range. It had to do with what was in the scope. The scope shows you what is. Webb nodded once. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The mission package is yours, he said. Full authority, full support. I want hourly check-ins until you're in position. Then radio silence is your call. He moved toward the door, then stopped without turning. One more thing. There's a component of this mission that Hogro's briefing did not fully address. I want you to hear it from me directly. He turned the asset still in the field. The one Cole doesn't know we have requested you specifically by name. The asset's name is Lieutenant Carradine. She is 26 years old, and she was Elias Reeves's last direct trainee before you. He let that sit in the air for a moment. She is currently in a position that Cole can reach in approximately 88 hours. You have less time than that. He walked out. Nadia is stewed in the blue-white room, with the rifle and the silence, and a weight in her chest that was not fear and was not grief, but was the particular compound of both that arrives when a passant understands fully and without reservation that what they are about to do is not only a mission. It is a death. It is a continuation. It is in the specific language of what Elias had tried to give her, and Marcus both, and what one of them had honored and one had broken. The thing that he had been trying to say all along in a line written by a stove light on a Tuesday night 14 months before anyone was ready to understand it. She had 88 hours. Realistically, given approach time and position establishment, she had 64. She picked up the notebook. She did not open it. She put it in her jacket, pressed her thumb against its spine, and walked out of the building into a morning that had turned cold and gray and was moving somewhere above the cloud cover toward weather 26 hours before position. The mission package included a detailed terrain analysis of the target area, a ridge system in a geography she was not at liberty to specify at an elevation that averaged 3,200 m above sea level, in conditions that the meteorological brief described as variable to severe with a 73% probability of wind events above 40 kilometers per hour in the primary engagement window. The ridge provided natural concealment for a sniper of Cole's capability, which was precisely why he had chosen it. And it provided a series of natural approach corridors that were on their face the obvious routes for a counter-sniper mission. Cole would have mapped those corridors. He would have watched them. He might have wired them. Nadia took the non-obvious route. The approach added 11 hours to the timeline and required a vertical climb of 847 m on a face that was not classified as a viable ascent in any operational planning document she had seen. Because the rock type was loose shale over granite, unstable at the surface, and reliable 6 centimeters below, which meant that every hand and foot placement needed to be tested before it was trusted. And the testing needed to happen in silence, because sound carried extraordinarily far at altitude when the air was cold and thin and the wind was for the moment still. She climbed through the night. The darkness was complete above the first 400 m, where the terrain blocked any ambient light from the valley below. And she worked by the tactile knowledge of the rock and the orientation she had memorized from the terrain map until it existed in her body rather than her mind. Her hands found the rock the way they found the rifle. Not groping, not hesitating, but inquiring, testing, confirming, moving. The drag bag on her back shifted its weight with every transition, and she compensated without thinking. The same adjustment made so many times that her body had built the counter-ocean into its response before her conscious mind registered the need. At 1,340 m of elevation, she stopped. She pressed herself flat against the rock face and held still for 4 minutes without moving. Not because she needed the rest, though her forearms were burning with a controlled heat of sustained load. And her fingers had gone to a particular focused numbness that was not pain, but was the body's way of conserving sensation. But because something had changed in the sound of the air above her, a pattern, or more precisely, the absence of a pattern. The wind that had been moving across the face of a ridge in a steady low-level current had stopped, not slowed, stopped in Nadia's experience. When wind stopped at altitude in the middle of a sustained movement, it was because something had interrupted the airflow, something between her and the ridge line, something present. She waited. She counted heartbeats, not seconds, heartbeats. Because at altitude her heart was working harder than at sea level, and the rhythm of it was more reliable than any mechanical count for measuring the kind of time that mattered here. The time between a thing being present and a thing revealing itself. 4 to 7 heartbeats. Then the wind returned, then a sound, barely a sound, more a suggestion of one, from approximately 30 m above and 15 m to her right. A boot on shale. The particular friction slide of a sole on loose material 1/100th of a second in duration instantly recovered. Someone had shifted their weight. Someone who was very, very good at not making noise had made 1/10th of a noise. She identified 3 possibilities. 1. The ridge had a second watcher. Cole had set a forward position. 2. Cole himself had deviated from the route the intelligence package had placed him on. 3. Someone else was on this face, and they were not from Cole's network. She waited 12 more minutes without moving. The cold was not abstract at this altitude. It was specific and invasive, pressing through the layers of her gear with a patient persistence of something that had all the time in the world and knew it. She let it in and then let it become background. The way a distant alarm becomes background when you've been listening past it for long enough. Then the sound came again, and with it barely audible, a controlled exhalation. The kind that a trained person makes when they're managing cold and altitude and effort simultaneously. The kind she recognized not because she had heard it recently, because she had heard it years ago on a range on cold mornings that seemed like a different century now. She made a decision. She brought her mouth close to the rock and spoke in a voice that was technically below a whisper, a directed breath, pushed with enough shape to carry the words 3 meters in still air. If you're here to kill me, you should have done it 4 minutes ago when I stopped moving. Silence. 7 seconds of it. Then from above and to the right, a voice that had the same quality as her own. Controlled, quiet, stripped of everything unnecessary. I'm not here to kill you. Lieutenant Carradine descended the last 6 meters of rock with a precision that confirmed everything Elias had given her. She was smaller than Nadia had pictured. Not slight, but compact, built with the structural economy of someone who had trained for a specific purpose long enough for that purpose to reshape their body. She had a cut above her left eyebrow that was 4 days old, cleaned but not treated, and her eyes had the particular depth of someone who had been operating alone in hostile terrain, past the standard threshold of reasonable endurance. She was in every visible way exactly what Elias Reeves's training produced. And she looked at Nadia with an expression that was not relief. It was something more complicated. The expression of someone who has held a position alone for a very long time and has not been certain whether rescue or confirmation was what they most needed, and has just discovered it might be neither. It might be continuation. He gave you the notebook. Kara said, not a question. She could see the outline of it through Nadia's jacket. He gave me the notebook. Nadia confirmed. Kara looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up. There's something you need to know about the mission package. Something that isn't in it. What wasn't in the mission package was this. For 22 months, the intelligence compromises that had cost 2 assets their lives and placed Carradine in an 88-hour window of exposure had not originated entirely from Marcus Cole's external network. They had been enabled, confirmed, routed, and in 3 specific instances, personally accelerated by a source inside the command structure. Not a field operative, not an analyst, a logistics and communications officer whose name appeared on no mission-critical document, because his job was to be the infrastructure through which mission-critical documents moved. Colonel Bradford Sims, 53 years old, 17 years in his current position. The kind of person who had become so thoroughly part of the furniture of command that nobody looked at him directly anymore. He was a background, the mechanism, the processing layer. He had access to communication rouetting at a level that meant he could see the traffic without appearing in any of it. And for 22 months, he had been extracting specific packets of that traffic. Asset positioning, movement schedules, the particular kind of operational detail that could only have come from inside, and passing them through a financial intermediary to a contact network that ultimately paid Marcus Cole's operational expenses. His motivation was not ideology. It was not grievance. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, and therefore the most difficult to detect. Money, a series of personal financial reversals that had begun with an investment and ended with a debt that exceeded his means, and a contact who appeared at the precise moment such contacts always appear. When the alternative to saying yes seems worse than the alternative to saying no, and the moral accounting gets done in a hurry, in private, without the benefit of the conversation you would have had with your better self if you'd had the time. He had one moment of near humanity in the accounting that Kara laid out for Nadia on that rock face in the darkness, where he had almost pulled back. One of the assets he had compromised had a family. He had seen the family photograph in a personnel file, not deliberately. It had been a document he was rooting, and for 3 days he had not sent the packet he was supposed to send. For 3 days he had been, in the most technical sense, not doing the thing. And then the financial pressure had reasserted itself, and the packet had been sent, and the asset had died 6 weeks later in circumstances that the official report attributed to operational exposure. He had attended the memorial. It stood in the back. Nadia listened to all of it without interrupting. The cold was still there. Her forearm still carried the heat of the climb. She absorbed the information the way she absorbed wind data, not emotionally, but structurally integrating it into a picture of the mission that was now fully and for the first time complete. Then she asked the one question she had been holding since she first read those 3 lines in her Rose document. How long have you known it was Sims? Kara met her eyes. Long enough, she said, since the second compromise. I identified the routing pattern from the field. I reported it up. She stopped. It went to Sims to be routed. The cold said nothing. The ridge above them was dark and still. He knows you know. Nadia asked. He knows someone in the field identified the pattern. He doesn't know it was me specifically. Kara paused. But Cole knows I'm here, and Cole knows I know. Which means if Cole knows, and Sims is feeding Cole, then the clock isn't 88 hours anymore. Nadia said it's whatever Sims' next scheduled communication window is. Kara nodded. Her jaw was tight. Not with Faye. With the precise held quality of someone who has been managing a situation alone for too long and has arrived. Finally, at the moment where the management either works or it doesn't. When is his window? Nadia asked. 18 hours from now. Kara said, give or take. 18 hours. Not 6 to 4. Not 88-18. Nadia calculated position establishment at the Rigel line would take 4 more hours of climbing minimum. Add 2 hours for zero verification and wind pattern mapping at altitude. That left 12 hours. 12 hours in position on a ridge in conditions that were moving towards severe to make 2 separate shots on 2 separate targets. One of which she could not yet see, and one of which was not the mission she had been formally tasked with. She pressed her thumb against the notebook. 1 second released. Show me the route to Cole's position, she said. She reached the ridge line at 0219 hours. The wind, as the meteorological brief had promised, was approaching severe, gusting to 47 km/h from the north-northwest with a temperature of -1 degree Celsius at the exposed crest. She settled into a natural depression in the rock, an irregular bowl about 2 m across and 40 centimeters deep that the wind passed over rather than into. It was not comfortable. Comfort was not the standard she was applying. The standard was sustainable for 12 hours without involuntary movement. It was sustainable. Kara was 23 m to her left behind a rock formation that gave her eyes on a different segment of the approach corridor. Her role was observation and communication, not engagement. They had one encrypted communication device between them, set to transmit only in compressed Bose pulses of 0.3 seconds, designed to be invisible to any standard signals monitoring. Before Kara had settled into her position, she had done one more thing. She had handed Nadia a small device, not standard issue, not anything that appeared in the mission package, and told her what it was and what it had recorded. Nadia had looked at it. She had understood immediately. She had put it in her jacket pocket next to the notebook. Then she had waited. Waiting for Nadia Reeves was not passive. Waiting was the most active thing she did. It was the application of total attention to a situation that had not yet completed its disclosure, with a discipline to receive that disclosure at its own rate rather than pulling at it. Elias had said once, not to her. She had overheard it, that the difference between a sniper and a shooter was not the shot. It was the 10,000 hours of nothing that made the shot possible. The nothing was not nothing. It was everything that didn't announce itself. She waited 4 hours. At 0611 hours in the gray pre-light that preceded the sun at altitude by approximately 40 minutes, the thermal scope on the M82 showed her what she needed to see. Movement 2,247 m to the northeast. A figure in a prepared position. She could see the hide, the careful construction of it, the way it used the natural rock as its primary concealment element and the manufactured elements as secondary. It was a good hide. It was exactly the kind of hide that Elias Ree had taught both of them to build. She recognized the architecture of it the way you recognize a handwriting, not by any single feature, but by the sum of choices, the particular expression of a particular philosophy built into every decision about cover, angle, and depth. Marcus Cole, 2,247 m. She observed him for 11 minutes before he moved again. He was looking northeast, not at her position, not at Carrara's, but at a third location approximately 1,400 m beyond his own position, where the intelligence package had placed Cara Din's cover location before Cara had moved. He had not yet updated his model. He thought he knew where she was. He was in a position from which he could engage that location. He had perhaps 3 hours before the light and angle gave him the shot he was waiting for. She did not have 3 hours in reserve. She had the window she had, and the window was now. But there was the second shot, the one that was not in the mission package. She looked left. Through the thermal scope, she could see at a distance of 847 m, much closer, almost uncomfortably so. A second figure also in a prepared position, also watching the northeast, also with a communications device that was even now being prepared for a transmission that would update Cole's model and give him Carradin's actual position. Colonel Bradford Sims had come into the field personally to make this transmission. She understood why. In retrospect, a transmission from an in the position was harder to trace than one from a fixed facility. He had come forward under the cover of a logistics inspection. He had signed himself out with paperwork that was entirely legitimate. He was in every official sense doing his job. She looked at him through the scope for a long time. She thought about the family photograph and the post-Nell file that he had seen and then looked away from. She thought about the memorial where he had stood in the back. She thought about what Elias had written. The scope shows you what is. What the scope showed her was this. If she took the sim shot first, Cole would hear it. At 847 m, the report was impossible to conceal and would adjust, move, or fire in Carrara's direction before she could reposition for 2,247 m. If she took the Cole shot first, Sims would complete his transmission in the window of her repositioning. Order of operations. The same problem in its fundamental structure as the 1,847 m gap shot through 14 centimeters of clearance in Webb's qualification room. Two things sequential, each dependent on the other, neither forgiving of error. The difference was that the gap shot had been clean geometry. This was not geometry. This was time. She needed Cole first. She needed Sims incapacitated, not killed, not injured, but prevented from transmitting. Within the time it took her to move from one firing solution to the other, and she needed to communicate something to Kara in the same window. She opened the burst device. She sent a 0.3-second pulse. One word, compressed. Kara would understand it. They had talked through the contingencies on the rock face at 0219. Then she settled back into position. She went to the stillness, the complete stillness, the one that was not a performance and not a technique, but the sum of everything she had ever been taught and everything she had ever earned in the 14 months of carrying a notebook that she had not yet earned the right to fully understand, but was at this moment beginning to 2,247 m, wind 47 kilometers per hour, gusting temperature -11, target in a prepared hide, stationary attention fixed northeast, round 50 BMG 660 grain projectile. Muzzle velocity 2,910 foot-pers, calculated drift 3.4 m. Left correction. Elevation 8.7 minutes of angle up. Time of flight to target approximately 2.3 seconds. She had calculated all of this before lying down. She was not calculating now. Calculation was over. There was only the breath and the pause and the thing that existed in the pause. She fired. The round crossed 2,247 m in 2.3 seconds. She was moving before the impact registered. She did not wait to confirm. She knew, in the same way she had known about the third shot at Fort Bragg. Not arrogance, not assumption, but the completed certainty of someone who has lived in this specific reality long enough to know the difference between hope and knowledge. 8 seconds. She moved 31 m along the ridgeline. Low, fast, silent. The wind covered what sound or movement made. The new position had a direct line on Sims at 847 m. He was reaching for his communications device. He had heard something, the wind maybe, or the subsonic edge of the report, and his head was turning, searching. She did not take the shot. She took out the device Kara had given her. She pressed the single button on its face and from the small speaker in Colonel Bradford Sims's communications device, the one he was holding in his hand at this very moment, the one he used to route transmissions that appeared as legitimate signal traffic, a voice emerged, his own voice recorded 3 weeks prior. In a conversation he had believed was private in a room he had swept for surveillance and found clean because a device recording him had been built into a component that no standard suite detected. His own voice speaking the specific rouetting codes, the specific packet identifiers, the specific financial account numbers, and the specific name of the contact network. His own voice in the particular tone of a man who has normalized something that has no normal. Speaking the details of 22 months of betrayal with the mundane efficiency of a man who has long since stopped needing to think about what he is doing. The transmission was broadcasting on an open command frequency, not to Sims only, to every communications device in the operational network, to the command center, to Webb's operations room. Sims stood completely still. His hand with the communications device dropped to his side. The color left his face from the forehead first. He looked in the direction of the sound, not at her. He couldn't see her. With the expression of a man who has just understood that the geometry of a situation has been irreversibly and completely changed, and that the change was accomplished not with a weapon, but with his own words, returned to him in the one context he had never prepared for, the truth in public. He sat down on the rock, not because he had been told to, because his legs made the decision before his mind did. Carradin's voice came through the Bose device. Compressed and clean. Cool down. Asset secure. Clean exit viable. Nadia lay with the M82 on the rock of the ridge line and looked at the sky, which was lightening at its far eastern edge from black to the particular gray-blue that precedes color by 20 minutes at altitude. The wind was still moving at 47 kilometers an hour. It was cold. She was cold. Her hands were steady. They had not shaken. They had not shaken for the entire 12 hours on that ridge. And they would not shake now, because the stillness was not a technique she deployed and then put away. It was, as Elias had tried to tell her for years, the thing she was made of. The argument she made quietly against everything that said this was impossible. She pressed her thumb against the notebook in her jacket. She held it there for longer than 1 second. She held it there until the gray-blue became gray and the gray began to carry somewhere in its furthest edge the first suggestion of light. For months later, the range at Fort Bragg smelled the same way it always smelled: diesel and cold earth and the sharp residue of propellant that no amount of ventilation fully cleared. The target was at 300 m, only 300. But the 8 students lying in the prone position behind their rifles were, most of them, finding 300 m sufficiently instructive because Nadia Ari had set a standard for the exercise that had nothing to do with distance. The standard was time. Time and position before the shot. Time as measure of patience. Time as the argument against the urgency that the body manufactures when it is uncertain. She walked the line, slowly watching hands, watching shoulders, watching the particular way each person held the space between intention and action. She had been teaching for 6 weeks. She had not expected to find it meaningful. She had found it more meaningful than almost anything that had come before. Because teaching was the act of returning, of taking everything that had been given to you and discovering in the act of giving it away that it had not diminished. It had multiplied. "Why do we wait?" asked one of the students, a young man, 22, with a focused expression of someone who was very good and knew it and was still young enough to let that knowledge create impatience. He was looking at the 300 m target with the contained energy of a runner at a starting line. At this range, any one of us could make this shot in the first 30 seconds. "Why do we wait 4 hours?" Nadia stopped walking. She stood behind him for a moment, looking at the target over his shoulder. Then she crouched down so that she was at his level. Her voice at the quiet register she used when she was saying something she meant. "What do you think the shot is for?" she asked. He considered this. He was not a stupid student. He was the best student she had. Elimination of the target. He said no. She said that's what the round is for. The shot is for something else. She stood. She looked at the line. 8 students waiting the way they had been told to wait. Some of them doing it authentically and some of them performing it. And she could tell the difference in the exact way she had always been able to tell the difference, by the stillness. The authentic stillness had no surface. The performed stillness had a surface that you could feel, the way you can feel when a person is holding their breath rather than breathing. "Master Sergeant Elias Reeves," she said, and the name landed in the cold air of the range, the way names land when they carry weight that has not yet been fully distributed by time, with presence, with specificity, with a quality of something that is still happening. He wrote something that I have been carrying for 14 months without fully understanding. I understood it on a Rigeline in conditions that I'm not at liberty to describe in the last 2 seconds before I fired a shot that could not fail. She paused. She reached into her jacket. She took out the notebook. She did not open it. She held it in her hand the way she always held it, with the particular reverence of something too important to be careful with and too central to be careless about. He wrote, "The scope shows you what is. The stillness shows you what matters." The line was quiet. The wind at Fort Bragg was behaving for once like a reasonable partner, present but not disruptive, moving from the west at approximately 9 kilometers per hour, the kind of wind that makes the flags extend without agitation. The young student spoke again, without tanning his head from the target. "What does it mean?" Nadia looked at the back of his head. She thought about a kitchen with a light above the stove. She thought about a rock face in the dark and a woman descending 6 m with the efficiency of someone who had been taught the same thing she had been taught and had chosen to honor them. She thought about Harrison Webb standing in a blue-white room looking at a target system readout for 7 seconds before turning with a face that had finally resolved. She thought about Bradford Sim sitting down on a rock, not because anyone told him to, but because the truth delivered in his own voice had the weight of something that he had never allowed himself to carry standing up. She thought about the pin inside her collar. Elias's pin, the one he had owned and then given away, not ceremonially, but practically, pressed into her hand on a Tuesday morning with no explanation. And she had pinned it to the inside of her collar where it touched her skin every day because that was where he had always worn it. Not displayed, but present. Not performed, but real. It means she said, choosing each word the way she chose each placement on a rock face. Tested, confirmed, trusted that what you see through the scope is only ever part of the picture. The scope gives you data, distance, wind, target position, what you know. But there is always something the scope can't show you. Something that is not in the data. Something that determines when the data give you two possible answers. Which one is true? And the only instrument that can read that, the only thing that can tell the difference between what is real and what is just visible is the stillness. Not the quiet of the range, the quiet inside you. The one that is still there when everything else is loud. The young student was silent for a long time. Then he put his eye back to the scope. She watched him. She watched his shoulders. She watched the breath slow. She watched the stillness begin. Not perform this time. Something different. Something that had in the previous 30 seconds become real. She walked to the end of the line. She crouched into position behind a rifle that had been placed there for her. Not the M82. Not today. A different rifle. A standard training configuration. 308 caliber. Nothing remarkable. She lay in the prone position and looked down the range at the 300M target and let the world go quiet around her in the way it had always gone quiet. Not because she made it quiet, but because quiet was what she was made of. She did not need a fire to prove anything. She had not needed to prove anything for 4 months. The shot was not for proof. It was for the thing the shot had always been for. The thing that lived on the other side of the stillness where the data ran out and the truth began. She heard very faintly the sound of Kara Den's footsteps on the gravel path at the edge of the range. Kara was arriving late to the session. She had been at a debriefing in Building 14 Alpha that had run over, and she moved with the contained efficiency of someone who was always slightly behind the schedule that other people set and never behind the one that mattered. She would take the empty position at the end of the line, and she would not say anything about being late, and Nadia would not say anything about it either, because some understandings did not require language, only presence. Nadia looked through the scope at the 300M target. At this distance, the target was almost laughably clear. Every marking sharp, every line defined. No ambiguity, no decision required. She could have made this shot at 17. She could have made it in her sleep, but she lay there anyway in the cold smell of diesel and earth and propellant with her hand still on the stock and her breath slowing to the place where the body ran out of words for what it was doing. And she spoke very quietly, not to the students, not to Kara, not to the range or the gray sky or the wind from the west. "I think I understand now," she said. Her voice was barely above her breath. "I think I finally understand what you meant." She exhaled. She found the pause, the natural respiratory pause, the half-second between out and in where the body is perfectly still and every element that is not the shot falls away. The cold and the noise and the weight of everything that has happened and the uncertainty of everything that is not yet. And in that pause, there was nothing at all, just the stillness and everything it showed her. The shot, when she pressed it, arrived at the center of the target with the clean and unremarkable authority of a thing that was never in doubt. The steel rang once, the same sound as always, the same honest acknowledgement, and then the range went quiet again. The way ranges go quiet after something that mattered, waiting in its patient and unhurried way for whatever comes next. The notebook rested against her ribs. The pen pressed against the inside of her collar. Somewhere above the cloud cover, something that might have been weather and might have been simply the sky continuing its permanent business of being larger than any of the things happening beneath. It moved across the gray in a direction nobody on the range was watching. And in the far distance at the eastern edge of the range, a new target was being carried to its post by a soldier Nardia did not recognize. Someone from a different unit. Someone doing a job that required no knowledge of what had happened on a Regeline 4 months ago, of what had been spoken in a blue-white room or a cold kitchen or a rock face in complete darkness. The target was being said at a distance she could not yet read from here, a distance that would require. When the time came, everything she had, she waited. The letter arrived on the 14th day of the 5th month. It came through channels that should not have existed, routed through 3 separate communications relays, each one a dead end by normal intelligence tracing standards. The kind of rouetting architecture that only a person who had spent years inside the system would know how to use from the outside. The envelope contained no return address. The handwriting on the exterior was block printed, deliberate. The letters formed with the same controlled precision that characterized everything Marcus Cole had ever done. Nadia's name was spelled correctly. That, too, was deliberate. She did not open it immediately. She carried it for 2 hours through a morning training session, through a debrief, through a meal she ate without tasting before she sat alone in the small equipment room at the back of Building 14 Alfred, and opened it in the same unhurried, considered way that she did everything. The room smelled of cleaning solution and the particular dry plastic of stored gear bags. A single overhead light, no windows. The fluorescent hum of it was different from the one in the main corridor, a tone higher, slightly steadier. The letter was 1 page, handwritten in the same block printing as the exterior. It had no greeting. It began directly in the way that people begin things when they have been thinking for a long time about exactly where to start and have finally decided that the beginning is the only honest place. I trained the same way you did. I learned the same things from the same man. I know the notebook. I know what's in it. I know the line he wrote. I've been trying to decide for 22 months whether it meant that I was wrong. I have arrived to the conclusion that I was not wrong about what the system owed me. I was wrong about what that entitled me to do about it. Those are different. I needed them to be the same. They were not. You understanding that difference before I did is not the reason you won. But it is the reason I am writing this. He was right about you. He told me once on a range that you were the argument he had been trying to make his whole career. I told him I didn't understand. He said you will eventually. He meant this. He meant exactly this. I don't ask for anything. I have no currency left to ask with. I want you to know that what you did on the ridge was the cleanest piece of work I have ever seen from any operator in any context. I was in the scope for 11 of the 14 seconds before impact. I did not detect your position. I did not detect your breathing. I detected nothing. You were not there. And then the round arrived, and that was the sum total of your presence. You would have been satisfied with that. The notebook belongs with you. Keep it, MC. She read it once. She folded it along its original crease. She placed it inside the notebook at the back behind the last page of Elias's writing in the space where the cloth binding met the final end paper. And she closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment. Not with grief, not with a complex satisfaction of vindication, with something that had no clean name. The particular compound of loss and continuation that arrives when the last account of something you did not know was open finally closes, and you realize that the closing of it does not mean the ending. It means the thing can now move forward without the weight of its own incompleteness. She put the notebook back in her jacket. She sat in the equipment room for 4 more minutes, listening to the fluorescent hum, letting the letter find its place in the larger architecture of everything that had happened. Then she stewed, adjusted her jacket, and walked back out into the hallway, which smelled of coffee that someone had recently made and was now getting cold in its pot. The way coffee always did in buildings, where the people who made it were too busy with other things to drink it before it changed. 6 weeks after the letter, Harrison Webb came to the range. He did not announce it. He arrived the way he arrived everywhere, with the self-contained momentum of someone whose schedule made no allowances for inefficiency and whose presence in any location was its own announcement. His aide was with him. 2 additional officers she did not recognize. He was not in uniform. He wore the kind of jacket that field personnel wore when they were in the field by choice rather than by assignment, which itself said something about the nature of this visit. The students were mid-session. The target was at 800 M today, a step from the 300 of 6 weeks ago. Because Nadia's progression system did not advance on the basis of calendar time, but on the basis of demonstrated stillness, and 3 of her 8 students had demonstrated enough stillness to justify the increase. The other 5 were still at 300. She had not apologized for this distinction. She had explained at once the distance does not change what the shot requires. It only changes whether the error shows up. Webb stood at the edge of the range for 11 minutes before she walked over to him. She did not hurry. He was watching the students, not her, with the focused attention of someone evaluating something he had been wanting to evaluate. 2 of them have it, he said. When she reached him, he did not specify which 2. He did not need to. 3, she said. He looked at the line again. He found the third. He nodded once. The small, resolved nod of a man who has recalibrated a detail. The inquiry, he said. He stopped. He gathered the next words with the particular care of a man who had given a great deal of thought to how to say something and had still not arrived at a version he considered adequate. The formal inquiry into Master Sergeant Reeves's final operation has been concluded. Full conclusion. The finding is in the affirmative for every decision he made in the field that day. He paused. It took 14 months and a mission that I cannot discuss in unclassified language to generate enough institutional clarity to reach a conclusion that his jaw tightened. That should have taken 72 hours. That delay was a failure of this command. I have said so in writing to the people who need to hear it in writing. Nadia looked at the range. The wind was moving from the southwest at approximately 12 kilometers per hour, which was favorable. One of her students, the young man who had asked, "Why do we wait?" was lying in a stillness that had over the past 6 weeks changed in quality from the performed kind to the real kind. She had watched it happen gradually, the way most real changes happened, not in a single day, but in the accumulation of days, each one adding something too small to measure until the sum became undeniable. "You would have said it didn't matter," she said. "Yes," Webb said he would have. "That doesn't mean it's true." She considered that it was, she thought, the wisest thing Webb had said in the entire span of their acquaintance. The gap between what a person would have accepted and what was right was not closed by the person's acceptance. It remained, and the people responsible for it remained responsible regardless of whether the person who had been wronged was still present to confirm or deny the weight of it. "Thank you," she said. She meant it simply without performance. Webb looked at her for a moment. "There's a second element." He reached into his jacket, the field jacket, not a formal uniform, and produced a small item. He held it out. She looked at it before taking it. A metal pinned silver bright with a design of a crossed rifle over a cartridge. The formal sniper qualification badge of the command. Not a copy, not a replacement. The original retrieved from the inventory of effects after Elias Reeves's death and held without explanation or assignment in an administrative file for 14 months. His name was engraved on the reverse in letters small enough that she had to tilt it toward the light to read them, and she did not need to tilt it because she already knew what it said. She was holding 2 pins, now as in her hand as against her collar. She closed her fingers around the one in her hand. She looked at the range. Then she looked at the students and at Carradine, who had arrived that morning not late for the first time since the debriefings had ended and was lying in the prone position at the far end of the line with the contained self-sufficiency of someone who has been through something that cannot be described to people who weren't there and who has decided to translate it into the only language that transfers reliably. Precision, patience, and the particular silence that follows both. "One more thing," Webb said. He was looking at the range, not at her. "I owe you an answer to the question I asked when you walked through that door. You remember it?" She remembered it. "Who are you?" He said, not a question this time. A statement. The statement of a man who has arrived through a route that was longer and more difficult than it should have been. At an answer that now seems so clear, he was almost reluctant to say it aloud. The way people are reluctant to say obvious things because the obviousness feels like an accusation of the blindness that preceded it. "I know who you are now," he said. "I knew it by the 14th second of the qualification room. I should have known it before you ever walked through the door. The file alone," he stopped. He almost smiled. "Almost. Next time someone hands me a file with Elias Reeves's name in it, I will read it differently." He turned and walked back the way he had come, his aide falling in his step beside him, the 2 additional officers following at the distance that seniority commands. She watched him go. The jacket he wore was the kind that had been field-washed many times, the colors slightly faded at the shoulders, the seams reinforced. He had not worn it for theater. He had worn it because it was the jacket he wore when something mattered. She turned back to the range. That evening, after the students had cleared and the range had been secured, Carradine sat on the low concrete ledge where the firing positions were set and looked at the empty down range with the expression she always wore when the day's work was finished, and there was nothing left to do but be whatever was left after the work was stripped away. Nadia sat beside her. The diesel and propellant smell had settled into the cold of the evening air and become simply part of the way the range smelled at this hour. Inseparable from it. Familiar, not unpleasant. He gave you the pin before the last operation. Karis said it was not a question. She had known for some time. She had been waking up to it. Yes, Nadia said. He gave me a letter. Karis said before the last operation. I didn't know it was the last operation. I didn't know he knew. She looked at her hands. The letter said she stopped. She started again, choosing the version that was complete enough to be honest without being more than she was ready to give away. He said that the work we were doing was not about the shots. He said the shots were just the most visible version of the work. That the actual work was the discipline of seeing clearly under pressure. Not just through the scope, but through everything. The noise, the contradiction, the cost that most people who could make the shot couldn't sustain the clarity required to make the right choice about when to make it. She stopped again. Her voice had not wavered. It had the quality of something that had been handled many times by someone who had handled it carefully enough that the handling itself had become a kind of strength. That's what he meant, the scope and the stillness. He was talking about all of it, the whole thing, seeing what is, and then being still enough to know what matters about it. Nadia looked at the 800-meter target, still just visible in the failing light as a dark shape against a dark background. The kind of visibility that made the shot technically impossible and yet remained in the field of view, present, waiting for the light to change. He was right, she said. He usually was, Kara said. He was also wrong about enough things to make the right things feel earned rather than given. A pause. That's the part one thing he wanted us to figure out ourselves. The range was quiet. Somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, a vehicle moved along the base road in a direction that had nothing to do with them. The flag at the entrance to the range had stilled with the evening air, hanging vertical and untroubled. The light above them was the particular blue-gray of a clear sky losing its color at the edges. The faux stars becoming possible at the zenith where the darkness was deepest. Nadia took the notebook out. She held it in both hands the way she always held it at the end of days that had cost something real. She thought about the letter from Cole folded inside it. She thought about Webb's pen in her jacket pocket. She thought about the students and the young man who had found his stillness, and the others who were still finding theirs, and the ones who would come after them, who did not yet know this range existed. She thought about a kitchen, a light above a stove, and a man writing something by hand that he intended to leave, not because he was certain of the ending, but because he was certain of the thing worth continuing. She opened the notebook to the back page. Not the page with his line, the page after it. The blank one, the one that had been blank for 14 months, the one she had looked at many times and always closed again, waiting for the moment when she would know what belonged there. She took a pen from her jacket. She wrote 4 words, small and deliberate, in the space below the final line of Elias Reeves's handwriting. She closed the notebook. She did not show Kara what she had written. She did not need to. What she had written was not for showing. It was for carrying. It was the thing she had been working towards since the moment she first pressed her thumb against the spine and felt the weight of everything she had not yet understood. And it was Hayes now, completely in the way that understanding becomes yours. Not when you receive it, but when you finally have something true of your own to add to it. The range was dark. The stars were fully present. The diesel and the cold earth and the residue of the day's work were present too. The way they were always present, unhurried and specific and entirely indifferent to significance. She was still, hey, that was enough. That was, she thought, and the thought arrived the way his voice had always arrived, quiet and direct and without announcement. Exactly enough.